This is a panel on the limits of analytics. I'm Cade Massey, going to moderate this fine collection of people. The motivation for the panel, we did this last year. I think it may be the only topic we're trying to repeat this year. We feel like in the middle of a day where we're celebrating analytics and we're evangelizing analytics, we need to stop and also recognize the limits of analytics. I think the motivation for that is twofold. One, we know overconfidence is a problem. In fact, many of us think overconfidence is one of the biggest problems in organizations and individual lives out there, and we don't want people to walk away from the conference or work with these tools in an overconfident way. The second motivation is we want to talk about where where new work could be done, where the greatest returns to work in this field are. And we can only do that by talking about where the holes are now. So that's what we're going to take up for the next 30 or 45 minutes. We've got the questions you can post. We're going to continue to collect some questions here in a little bit. I want to introduce the panel. We've got an interesting and diverse panel here. Dan Altman, the first chair here to my left, is a PhD economist from Harvard. He teaches at NYU. He is well published in a wide range of outlets: Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, New York Times, New Yorker. He's also the author of multiple books, 4 books, I believe. Recently, he has founded and works heavily in his North Yard Atlantics consultancy, which is focused on soccer. And his clients include the very highest and best in that profession. And much of that is around personnel evaluation. So it should be something that you guys can identify with. Kathleen Hogan is the Chief People Officer at Microsoft. She did her undergrad also. She has a degree from Harvard, math and econ at Harvard. She also has an MBA from Stanford, and after that worked in the McKinsey office out there in Silicon Valley before starting at Microsoft in 2003. She's only recently moved into the HR function. So she got pulled in, didn't take the traditional route to HR. In fact, her first job out of college was as a programmer for Oracle. So she's coming to this topic from a very different perspective. Micheal Mauboussin, one of the managing directors, and I'm going to get the title right, Micheal, make sure I get this right. Head of Global Financial Strategies at Credit Suisse. Micheal is also the author of multiple books, including The Success Equation, which has received a lot of attention from people in our field. Micheal is the kind of guy who'll send you white papers that are both more interesting and more relevant than academic papers that we run across. And interestingly, he's also the chairman of the Santa Fe Institute. So he can talk about a wide range of topics. Finally, we have Tim Urban. Tim, as some of you know, is the creator and lead writer of Waitbutwhy. And it was interesting to see the reaction to some of the folks in the back of the room when Tim walked in. He got lots of these, I'm a big fan reactions from folks out there, including possibly the chair of the conference committee, I think. Tim writes on a wide range of topics. I think of him as a great explainer. He takes these very complicated topics and writes in insightful and entertaining ways. Takes up topics like AI, which we've been talking about in this conference, Elon Musk, Gen Y, and some little things like procrastination, religion, and time, and sheds light on these topics. I want to say a little bit more about Tim because something happened this week that is interesting and relevant, especially for those in this community and in Philadelphia. Sam Hinkie has been the general manager of the Philadelphia 76ers, and he's been at the vanguard of the people analytics movement in sports, and he's been a controversial figure in sports because he took it so seriously. And 2 days ago, Hinkie resigned. In resigning, he resigned via a 13-page letter that he wrote to the ownership, 12 owners of the Philadelphia 76ers. And this letter, people are kind of abuzz about this letter because it's incredibly erudite. And in this letter, he says lots of things. He's a very gracious guy. He said lots of gracious things, but it's very interesting. He cited, among his citations, Gawande, Buffett, Lincoln, Munger, Musk, Tversky, Plunk, and Tim Urban. So, in fact, he called Urban and said he'll soon be recognized as one of tomorrow's polymaths. And he got a little piece of advice to his owners, to his former bosses. Like many of you, he lives in New York. I'd recommend meeting him for coffee sometime, which is awesome. So this is the quote he used in his paper, which I think is incredibly relevant to our panel today. He quoted Tim saying, "So if we want to think like a scientist more often in life, we need to be humbler about what we know, more confident about what's possible, and less afraid of things that don't matter." So it's a great note to start on. And in fact, the reason we want to bring Tim in is to give us that outside perspective on people analytics. So we're going to give Tim the floor first.
All right, thank you. When I started writing, I always said that, I'm hoping one day to be part of the inspiration for a basketball GM to quit. Check. Everyone's dreams sometimes come true. That is a good quote to start with, actually, because that came from a post I did at the end of a series that I wrote about Elon Musk. And I had a chance to work a little with Elon in making that series and spend a little bit of time with him. And I spent the time trying, other than just being awkward with him, because he's awkward and I'm awkward. Bad combination. But I spent a lot of the time trying to figure out not just, what he was doing with Tesla, what he was doing with SpaceX, big topics, but why he can do this stuff. You can't do that stuff. I can't do that stuff. What is it about this guy? And it's not just that he's smart. A lot of people are smart. It's not just that he's rich. A lot of people are rich or ambitious. So it's not his hardware that he was born with, I believe. And so I wrote a post, the last post of that series, trying to get to the bottom of what was it about him. And I kind of honed in on his software, which is, the systems of thinking, his worldviews, the way he reasons, as I think the thing that separates him. And he always talks about reasoning by first principles versus reasoning by analogy. It's a simple distinction, but it's so important, and it's a simple idea. When you reason by analogy, you look at what's been done before, what other people are doing, what conventional wisdom says you're supposed to do. When you reason by first principles, you take in data as much as you can and your own experience, and you say, okay, well, what do I know? What seems like what I know right now? And then let me use those as the building blocks to build a conclusion through my reasoning. And it's a very independent process. And sometimes that reasoning leads you to a place that is contrary to what conventional wisdom says, and is contrary to what is being done and what people think is supposed to be done. That can apply to life, the way you live your life. It can apply to work and business and lots of things. And I think it's Elon's ability to just trust his reasoning, even in the face of conventional wisdom, which he's done with, of course, doing an electric car and rocket startup at the same time. Those are insane. Both of those were what people would say that's not possible. It hasn't been done because it can't be done. He thinks differently. And you see this throughout the business world, of course. And the classic example is, Apple threw the phone industry on its head, not by saying, well, what are they doing? Okay, let's make it even better. Let's make it like an Apple-y version. They didn't say, where should the keyboard be and what should the keyboard look like? Let's make it a cool Apple keyboard. No, they said, what should a smartphone be? And they started with that blank slate. And then they got to the end and there was no keyboard in their own reasoning. It doesn't matter that there wasn't that was not normal. Of course, Tesla and SpaceX, perfect examples, just trying to do things that are flipping industries on their head by just having some independent reasoning. Not necessarily brilliance. The iPhone it's not that brilliant a design. It's simple, but it's just someone who said, I think we can do better if you just think about it for a second. And this, if you think about it, mirrors an age-old distinction. Way back hundreds of years ago, in I think the 16th century, you had two camps when they studied the Grand Canyon. You had the people that said, well, we know one fact. We know from the Bible that this is 6,000 years old. And so the flood must have created all this stuff, even if all the evidence, and there's fossils, and it looks like it should be much older. We have to come up with some reasoning that makes sense because we know that it began 6,000 years ago. Then you had scientists who came in and said, we know nothing. And let's start from there. And let's take information as it comes. And we will eventually build our way up to a conclusion. And for them, the conclusion turned out, oh, wait, the Earth is billions of years old. And I think that most of us today would identify with the scientists. We think, well, that's like me. I would be one of the scientists. I don't follow dogma. And yet, when it comes to a lot of the way we live, and especially a lot of the way we run our businesses, we're a lot more like the flood geologists than I think we'd like to believe. We very often, even if we have a new startup company or we're working at our company, we kind of think, well, let's look at what's been done and let's iterate on that. We're reasoning by analogy. We are reasoning by the dogma of that industry, of that time. And I think one of the major challenges for each individual person and for each individual business is to question that and to start trying to do what Elon does and to try to reason upwards from first principles to fresh, original conclusions. Not necessarily brilliant, but in order to do that, you have to be able to fail. Scientists fail constantly. An experiment that fails, no one says, you failed, you're bad. They say, cool, new data, let's keep going. And if we should be viewing business that way, we should be saying, yeah, bosses should be saying, fail constantly, just experiment, do stuff. Let's get to fresh ideas, challenge the existing ideas. And I think some bosses do that better than others. Some company cultures do that better than others. But when it comes to something like people analytics, I think that this is a tricky component of people analytics, because I don't know that much about analytics, and I'd love to hear what my fellow highly intimidating panel members have to say. Great people you stuck me up here with. But my hunch is that analytics is going to, I like to call the dogma analogy kind of people cooks. You're being a cook, you're following a recipe. And then there's a chef. The chefs invent the recipe, they write the recipe. I'm worried that people analytics, for all the good things it does, it may favor cooks. It may make cooks look better in the long run. It may show how the cooks are shining and actually not really show how the chefs are doing. The chefs might actually come out badly through some of these people analytics and may be overlooked and actually may be penalized for it. It might be rewarding cookdom, if that's a word. So I think that's a decent place to start. I'd love to hear what people have to say about that.
Any of you guys interested in responding?
Even within the people analytics community, it's how do we make sure we have chefs and not, quote, just the cooks, right? Because coming into the role, got a lot of reports and a lot of analysis that we've always done, a lot of reporting that we've always done. And then I really started tapping into some of the chefs that said, hey, what if we looked at this data, and had a hypothesis here, and then we'd come up with really new insights. So even within people analytics, we're looking at how do we have more chefs, and not as, we need the cooks too, but you also need the chefs to really get the insight.
How do you get more chefs? Where do you find chefs? How do you incorporate chefs into organizations that might want to reject chefs?
We don't want to reject the chefs, so I don't know how to answer that one.
A lot of times I think it's about creating a culture that encourages people to bring out their inner chef. We all have a little of each in us. We're all chefs in some part of our lives and cooks in others, and it's about the culture that really rewards the chef behavior, and as opposed to kind of maybe without realizing it, making that behavior kind of seem like a negative thing.
Yeah,
right.
But you got to be conscious that you're asking organizations to do something that's really difficult. To make a cultural change, a shift in their management techniques, and if your new method is obviously great, like if you put the iPhone in my hand for the first time and you show me what it does, I say, wow, that's obviously great. It's obviously better than this piece of crap clamshell phone that I have in my other hand. And so I have no problem taking up the iPhone right away. But if you come to me and you say, I'm going to tell you a totally different way of recruiting employees, and you're also going to have to change the way you manage your people so that you can get the best out of these employees. And I'm going to say, well, all right, where's the proof that this is going to work? Where have you tested this? What kind of transition can you offer me? It's much more difficult to make that kind of change.
Oh, and by the way, it's only probabilistic, right? It's probably going to work. It's probably going to improve.
Right. You might not see results this year, but over a 10-year period, you'll get more hits than misses.
Mm-hmm. Very compelling, Dan.
Yeah,
Very
thank you.
Well, I think the key, reflecting on your question, I think the key is to listen to the chefs, right? We had this one question, which is why are people leaving Microsoft to go, to come back to have a higher level? That was the assertion. And everybody was thinking this was a mobility issue and we had to solve it. And the team said, hey, hang on, let us actually get the data. Let us do some hypothesis. And they came back and actually showed that the people who stayed versus the people who came back were accelerated at 16% higher. And so all of a sudden you've got great data that you can use to debunk some of these myths or some of these assertions. And you start listening to them, you start using that insight, and I think that encourages more chefs to help you.
Micheal, you crunch a lot of numbers in your business. Do you think that there's this risk of too much cookdom as analytics makes bigger and bigger inroads?
Cade, I actually think that the bigger, I mean, sure, I hear that point. I think the bigger problem is we're not doing enough with analytics, candidly. So I think the big issue is more the opposite.
You want to change the topic of the panel?
Yeah, it sounds like that. Sounds like that's where I'm going. Is that all right?
Yeah, good.
But I guess I'd like to make, because I actually want to talk about one limit, but I'll tell you the one thing that I keep coming back to is why do we not do more with this stuff? And I think there's something very fundamental. It's very important for all of us to acknowledge is that human beings love stories and they struggle with statistical thinking. Regular people, not people here, but regular people, right? And I'm going to give you one experiment that I thought really captured this incredibly well. So this is from medicine, so the medical school. And so they go to these people and they say, you have a horrible disease, very unpleasant, you want to get better. You have two treatment alternatives. Alternative one is 50-50 efficacy. So you can always, you've got that in your back pocket, 50-50. In alternative two, they showed people one of these following combinations. They showed them 30% effectiveness, 50, 70, or 90. So you see one of those four. But it was paired with an anecdote that was positive, negative, or neutral about someone like you. Right? So you're getting some pair of a story and a base rate. Okay? So the question is, how do people decide in these situations? So it turns out if you give them a positive anecdote, they will pick the 30% effectiveness. Now 30 versus 50, they'll pick it almost 8 out of 10 times. If you give them a negative anecdote, the last person like you that had this treatment didn't go well, they will pick the 90% effectiveness. Now 90 versus 50, less than 4 out of 10 times. The stories swamp the base rates and statistics as people decide in the real world, not this group, okay? So to me, that's the thing. You know, Danny Kahneman had a great line in his book where he says, statistics are basically pallid. There's nothing there. They don't animate. And stories are fundamentally about causality, and causality is deeply human. And we love it, and they're easy to remember, and they're easy to pass on to others. So that's one of the messages I would say about limits is that we may have some communication problems saying, like, if you can envelop some of your reasoning and thinking in some sort of stories that are instructive, I think they're much easier to digest. The second thing, I do want to give one story about a limit, because it comes from University of Pennsylvania. One limit of prediction I thought was an amazing story. It's from Howard Weiner. You probably know this story, Cade. It was about education. So everyone wants to improve education. We get it. We're all on the same page. And so they were like, all right, let's go to different schools, and we're going to see which schools have the best scores, standardized scores. And what they found was small schools had the schools with, say more carefully, the schools with the highest scores were small schools, and bigger schools had much more average scores. We're like, got it. Small schools, that's the key to everything. In fact, there were billions of dollars spent, including the Gates Foundation, and I mean this, literally billions of dollars spent on this initiative, including one big school in Seattle that was broken into 6 little sub-schools, right, in order to pursue this. And then someone had the idea, like, well, let's see, which schools have the worst scores? And it turns out small schools have the worst scores too, right? So this is what you learn in your first statistics class, right, which is small sample sizes have large variance. Right, like babies, if only a few babies are born, you get lots of boys or girls. And then large samples have smaller variance for the same population. So here we are, having spent billions of dollars in a very important positive initiative, right, to get more education, and yet it's like we miss stats 101. So there's an example of a limitation where I think the goal was obviously laudable, but the execution, because of simple oversight, came to a very bad outcome.
So you've given us two, one on communication and stories, and stats alone aren't going to get the
job done.
Aren't going to be persuasive. Dan, I'm curious, you've spent some time trying to persuade organizations that might not traditionally do a lot of analytics, professional soccer clubs, professional soccer players. What have you found in trying to persuade them with stories or just data? Where have you run into the limits of analytics in those conversations?
Well, I think it brings together two of the things that Micheal was saying, because we can do a ton of stuff in sports analytics. We have barely scratched the surface of what we can do to suss out different aspects of players' abilities, coaches' abilities, the way players work together on the field. We have barely scratched the surface in what we can find. Of course, to get the most out of those data, we have to do some pretty complicated stuff. And I gave a talk last year where I said, well, we could start out by doing things like counting goals. Then we can maybe count shots in soccer. Maybe we could estimate how likely a given shot is to score and give a value to a shot based on that. And oh, by the way, if I have tracking data where I can track all the players on the field and the ball and the referees, I can tell you that the players who pass the ball into the kernel of a star-shaped space based on the barycenter of that convex space are more likely to create scoring chances. Well, that's a really valuable insight, but how am I going to sell that to a team? Because teams have no way of judging what I can do except the fact that I have some fancy degrees. They want to understand how everything works. And the teams are run by smart people, many of whom have not finished high school. So I have to be able to explain everything that I'm doing. And so I tend to use some of the simpler things, which are still quite effective, but I need to be able to explain it to gain their trust. We can't make the leap all the way to the barycenter in the kernel of the star-shaped space.
Dan, are you even saying that because you have to explain, you may not be able to do the analysis that you'd like to do? Is it that much of a constraint?
Well, I would say that the marginal gain of going from something which is somewhat advanced but explainable to something which is very difficult to explain to someone even with a layperson's regular educational background is sometimes not worth the effort and the potential lack of trust. So there is an enormous amount we can do, but what we can actually implement falls short of that. And that gap is actually growing as more people with fancier tools get into this space.
Kathleen, you've walked into this space kind of new in the last year. What have you seen, we'll stay with the story idea for just a little bit longer. What have you seen as people have brought you analyses that you found effective or ineffective navigating this limit that some people run into with analytics?
Just to answer that, I think for us, we've got Power BI, and the more we use data visualization, the better it is. In fact, I just did a presentation to our top 200, if you will, which is our executive team. And they said, God, that was the first time we really understood a lot of the HR data because we really use data visualization to tell the story versus just lots of huge charts with lots of data.
Numbers.
Yeah, numbers. But as you know, I came here really thinking, oh, let me tell all these great stories about how we're using data to empower ourselves because that's really what we're all about. And yet then you've made me reflect over the last day about the limitations. And listening today, though, I've really reflected on a lot of the limitations we have. If I think about my core priorities, one is evolving our culture. We want to embed our culture in a growth mindset, which is really about how do you motivate people to take risks, realize failure is essential to mastery, et cetera. And so we do track, are people aware of what a growth mindset is? Do they believe that people are living the growth mindset? So you have that qualitative data, but can I really get at, are people really exhibiting a growth mindset? That's a huge limitation. On the recruiting front, this made me think today as well. We've gotten a lot of great insights on recruiting. In fact, we've done an analysis to show that A schools versus BC schools, 5 years out, same quality of hire at Microsoft. In fact, the BC schools have less attrition. So it even say, you're better off going to the BC schools. And that's been very powerful for us as we think about increasing diversity and not just going to one school. But then last night we talked about, okay, well, how are you assessing that talent? And is that the way you're measuring whether that talent is high quality? Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. But it's directional. Even diversity and inclusion, we do look at female, male, we look at race. But one of the things we're really trying to get at is abilities. And they're invisible abilities. And how do you really get at that?
Diversity of abilities.
From a diversity perspective. So, there's a lot of great things that we're using data for across all of the dimensions, but then there are limitations. Even performance and development, we just talked about that. We had ratings. There were benefits in getting that data. Who are the hypos? How do you differentiate? How do you give special stock awards? There were unintended consequences of being data-driven. People didn't like the ratings. It was demoralizing to be the 3. It was demoralizing to be the 2 when you thought you should be the 1. So those are the limitations as well. So I could go through each of the things and talk about how data is making a huge difference, but there are limitations.
Can I add one thing? I noticed that almost all the metrics that you're talking about and the qualities that you're talking about are individual qualities. Definitely in my field, it's just as important to look at goodness of fit. So, about half of our effort is on individual quality and about half is on goodness of fit. If you're bringing a player from one team to another team, you need to know that they're going to slot in. And that's something that can be much more difficult to measure, but I would say it's just as important to success.
Oh, I think it's great. And even in our review model or our performance, we call it a objective framework, but with subjective assessments. But we've gone from just having your individual performance to having 3 criteria. Individual performance, did you contribute to the success of others? And did you leverage from others, right? And really trying to It's still subjective, but it's a little bit more objective in terms of breaking down what are the criteria versus just saying it's all the individual.
Dan, can you give an example of being more objective about that kind of measure? So you say you measure goodness of fit. Now, sports has some benefits that maybe Microsoft doesn't, but just give us an illustration of how you would do that objectively in your domain.
I can't tell you too much because a lot of this stuff is very heavily proprietary and teams are extremely guarded about it. But one thing that we can do, for example, is we can show the areas on the field where the player is most productive. We have ways of measuring the productivity of every action that they do in terms of the likelihood of resulting in goals and points. And so we can show the areas where they're most productive, and then we can overlay those areas for all the players on the team who might be on the field together. And we're going to look for we're going to look for overlaps in certain areas, and we're going to look for complementary zones in other areas. And we can do that quantitatively, not just by inspection on a heat map. And that guides us to what is sort of the best way to put together the pieces of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm. Michael, you're a big sports fan. You're sympathetic to this approach. How might you bring that into
No, I think it's
CS?
awesome. Yeah, that's awesome. But one of the things I was just thinking about in this conversation is a little bit of game theory stuff, right? Which is, and Dan, maybe I could ask you this question because, think about if everybody knows we're supposed to go for it on fourth down in the NFL, or we're supposed to do certain things, certain situations, and everybody gets the word, then all of a sudden there's a counter effect by your competitors. And so I wonder if how to a degree that applies to business. But in the world of sports, I think that could be another thing we might be facing, which is everybody starts to understand, small players, three-point shots, that's the way you win games, and all of a sudden now all the defenses realign to defend these particular spots, and it opens up a whole different inefficiency, if you will, in the market. So it's an ongoing game, ongoing thing, which really, so that's another interesting potential limitation is we think we've got it sort of figured out, but it's action-reaction, right? It's sort of game theoretic, and in business and in sports, certainly those are worlds where that happens. Right? So if we're all glomming onto the same kind of metrics, do we somehow overlook things that are important?
This is interesting because it actually, I'm a Bostonian, Pats fan, Bill Belichick, God bless his heart, he is a chef.
He has a heart?
That was a setup for that one.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah.
But he's a chef as a coach, classic. He's doing the fourth downs. He's doing all kinds of stuff, and it's so. And yet, I mean, because he's looking at data. He's not being a chef. He's looking at data, and he's just acting on it, even though no one else is. And you see all the other coaches kind of look over and be like, "What's he doing?" And then, well, no one else is doing it, so I'm still not going to. And it's the resistance when the stakes are high, and the higher you get up, the bigger the organization gets. The resistance to go with what the data is telling you is right against conventional wisdom becomes so strong that even when it's obviously better. So I do think that, yes, eventually when Belichick is doing this again and again, you'll start to see a second copycat, and then a third, and then it becomes a thing.
So by the way, I mean, what's the Belichick of the non-sports world in people analytics? Who are the Pats of the non-sports world? You heard Kahneman say it on stage just yesterday. It's Google probably, right? So to what extent are people looking at that and copying, and then at some point, if everyone's doing the same thing, do they lose that advantage?
Well, Google started, everyone else was doing search engines in 1999 by how many times the word appeared on the page. Google thought, we have a better way, let's try this. And they were experimental, and they weren't scared of failure. They had nothing to lose. And they completely changed everything just by being a chef about it. And in that case, everyone did follow. But you know what? They were first, and they didn't lose their advantage.
Yeah, but it becomes a sort of case of evolutionary biology more than game theory. I'll give you an example which is happening right now. In the past few seasons in the English Premier League, which is one of the biggest soccer leagues in the world, most teams started to play a system of 4-2-3-1 formation where they tried to use a lot of passes to build up play and look for an incisive pass to finish with a shot and score a goal. So it was a sort of very deliberate, kind of the way you would see in an ice hockey game or basketball game, passing around the arc, passing around the point, looking for an opening. That was different from the way that people had played for decades in that league. They used to play what was called Route 1 football, straight up, as direct as possible, beat everybody with speed. But people had shifted to this other way of playing because there had been a couple teams that were successful playing this way. Now, this season, and part of last season, one team, Leicester City, has gone back to the old way.
Right.
They're playing very direct football. They are so fast on the break, they're faster than anybody else and more direct than anybody else. If you push them to the flanks and force them to pass the ball more, then their chances of scoring go way down. But as long as they maintain that shape, they play a 4-4-2 direct quite often, sometimes 5 at the back too, then they're deadly, and they're in fact leading the league this season. So it shows that this 4-2-3-1 system, the build-up system, was not robust to an invasion of this prior system. It's like the hawks and doves problem that you may have heard about, John Maynard Smith. So, you know, we can see this constant cycling. When everybody starts doing one thing, then the population becomes vulnerable to an invasion by somebody even doing something that they used to do, which is quite remarkable. And you see it at a more micro level with analytics as well, because you want to make sure that when information becomes universally available, like how we evaluate you, for example, that it's still useful. But you know, you have Goodhart's law suggesting that as soon as a metric becomes a target, it's not a useful metric anymore. You have to find those that are incentive compatible as well.
Jump in, Michael.
Okay, no, just one thing I was mentioning, I was just because your Hinkie opening and Tim's comment about Belichick is one other aspect. Now, again, I'm not sure it's a limitation of analytics per se, but how we digest it, and that's our time horizons. And you know, it's an interesting thing. So I mean, Hinkie sort of laid out this path where he said, "I'm setting the team up for it takes 3, 4, 5 years, and we're going to set it up for a long period of success." So he's trading kind of mediocrity, you know, sort of like an okay team to plummet, to get to hopefully to get a lot better. And so Belichick, sort of, I mean, the guy, he's obviously been very successful. He's bought time. So he's made decisions that, you know, November 2009, they went for it on 4th down against the Colts. They got failed. Yeah, super Colts. They failed. Peyton Manning times scored a touchdown. They lose the game. He gets crucified in the press the next day. But his job is safe, right? Because the guy wins over time. But it's interesting. So, like, what is a tolerance? And because you pointed out, Cade, before, it's really important. These are probabilistic decisions. They're probabilistic decisions. So what is the tolerance for us to put up with, whether it's bad luck or just the odds don't work for us? And you know, that's a really interesting another topic that we have.
All right, you said that you know, Dan mentioned the iPhone. If I had someone hands me the iPhone, it's great. Okay, but it's a spectrum. So a new idea can be obviously great all the way down to, it seems like Airbnb seemed like a terrible idea to everyone, and it turned out to be a good idea. So where in that spectrum, you know, does an organization decide this seems potentially great enough that I'm going to, even if it's a 5-year thing, you know, I'm going to give it a try. Where does that decision making come in?
I'll tell you, like I had Clay Christensen, who was the father of disruptive innovation, at a conference in 2007 when they launched the iPhone. I said, "How's that going to do?" He goes, "Thumbs down, almost guaranteed failure." No, seriously, and he had a whole reason as to why it was.
It's always good to diss Harvard professors on this stage.
It's easy in retrospect to say, yeah, because I'm calling it
Well, and we talked a lot about this last night, which is this time horizon in terms of how do you measure success, right? And so at Microsoft, at the executive level, we really tried to do a part is performance, and then part is power for the future, because you could do just power for the future and then completely, you know, your shareholders are really upset because you're not delivering anything in the here and now, or you could just milk the here and now and not create power for the future. So getting that measurement right and incenting the leadership team to deliver both power or performance but power is something we're trying to.
Power an acronym for something cool?
Yes, I guess it is. Power is, you know, creating power in the future, so long-term success. So you can think about, you know, revenue, operating income, that's performance, but innovating what's next and making those big bets, even if they don't pay out for 5 years, is creating power for the future. And how do we incent and measure both?
Kathleen,
and assess performance based on both.
You're raising an issue that's generally challenging for analytics, and that is measurement. And it's one of the things that, you know, I do work in sports analytics as well, like Dan, and we like to say, you know, the cutting edge stuff is happening here, and eventually it'll trickle down to organizations, but we have a benefit of very nice performance measures. What are you seeing and what are you thinking about internally on what analytics might help, how analytics might help you better measure performance, or do you think we're still a long way from that?
I'd say we're a long way away, but you know, at the end of the day, there is judgment. You know, it's interesting because Satya and I've spent a lot of time because in terms of what some of the external people would like in terms of his pay as well as the leadership's pay, they want it to be very formulaic, right? But then Satya's like, but I want to be able to have that judgment, right, in terms of how I ultimately assess how people are doing. And so we're trying to get the best of both worlds, which is have a framework, be super clear, here are the 4 metrics, or the 4 buckets upon which we'll assess. Some of them are more quantitative, but then also allowing for this sense of qualitative management judgment that has to come into this as well. It is an art and a science. Yeah. We haven't figured out how to make it completely formulaic. We've looked at other companies that have made it formulaic, and we think there are downsides to that too.
There's a real tension there. My co-professor in the course I teach at Stern, another school, is Philip Mayman, who also is a basketball analytics expert. And he says that a lot of organizations that he works with say, okay, well, if I'm the president of the basketball operations or I'm the GM, well, I've got the information coming from my analysts, which is all formulaic, as you say. I've got some from my scouts, which I may be able to codify a bit, and I've got some from my coaches, but it's basically subjective. And I'm going to sit on top of those 3 groups, and I'm going to take all their inputs, and I'm going to make some subjective evaluation about what's useful and what's not. And that's the way a lot of organizations work, and that's a sort of safe way for them to feel, because there's still someone making that decision, as Sachin would like to do. And Philip says that's totally wrong. If you do that, you waste your analytics. You need analytics sitting on top. Because how are you going to make the most of the logical and rational statements that you get from your analysts if you're not evaluating them in a logical and rational way? So he's really raising one of the big risks for people who do people analytics, which is that their products of their work will not be used correctly, and thus it will be misjudged. Right? If I give you great information but you use it badly, then you may think I'm a bad analyst.
So this might take us in, that it's a powerful point, and in the time we have remaining, which isn't that much, I want to hear, what do we do about that? So what do you wish for the field? What do you hope for them to be working on? What do you ask this room to go back and work on in order to push out those limits and navigate some of these limits?
Oh, I'm first. I think, back to the Belichick example, the first thing is when there are good analytics that stand in the face of conventional wisdom, to trust them, to follow them, and to do what humans really hate doing, which is defying what we've had proven to work, defying conventional wisdom. And the second thing would just be to have the people who work in analytics and who think about this stuff. If you're thinking about the mediocre team next year, if you're thinking about making sure that the short term is okay, which you need, it's not everyone can, sometimes a company will go under if they have a 9-win season like the 76ers. You can't just pull that in a lot of companies, so you have to. But, making sure the analytics don't just focus on that and actually a really rewarding chef-like behavior that results in failure often, like any good experiment does, and is able to have that kind of long view taken into account.
Who's going to fund that?
Yeah, I don't know, but the winner, the companies who do it, they have such a better chance of exploding as
That's true.
I have a couple, bought some time from Tim talking, so I got a couple thoughts. One is I think the translation issue, and I think Dan raised it, I think that's right. And a friend of mine's a director of analytics for one of the NBA teams, and he just tells me, we have these 5 pages on all these things, but we relay it to the coaching staff, and they break it down to, here are the 3 things you need to focus on. It's the highest leverage 3 things. Could they do 6 things? Yeah, but the 3 things, that gets us 80% of what we want, and we're a more effective team. So I think that's one element, and maybe the storytelling, but the translation factor. The second thing, I do think it's a buy-in element, and I think the buy-in thing is really crucial in a lot of organizations. And Paul DePodesta, who was with the Mets and just went to the Cleveland Browns, has told this great story. So I guess he went to the combine, and I guess there were guys dissing him in the line behind him. But anyway, he was saying like a lot of this journey is like going to the amusement park with your kids, and your kids go there and they see this huge roller coaster and like, yeah, that's really cool. Take me to the roller coaster. And you're like, no, you sure? Like, yeah, I want to go on the roller coaster. You wait 45 minutes in line. It's really hot, and you get to the front, and the kid goes, I don't think so. Running away. He's like, but then even if you get on the roller coaster, it goes like this. And he's like, sometimes you're completely terrified, other times you're euphoric. He's like, and hopefully, and when you're terrified, you want to get off, right? So his whole point is maybe at the end of the ride, you'll say, well, that was a lot of fun, let's do it again. But even an analytics journey is going to have this. And it's really important to recognize, because it's just chance, it's probabilities. And so that's another thing, is to get that buy-in to say, if you're going on the roller coaster, get what we're going to have fun by the end, but there are going to be some ups and downs as we go through this.
I would have one thing that I think we, at least as the management, can do, and then I'd have an ask for the team. I think from a leadership perspective, it's really recognizing and valuing how important this function is, this people analytics function. Don Klinghofer, who leads that for Microsoft, was recently promoted, and it was great to have just that unanimous support about, wow, this is such an incredible asset this team has built, it's so important. But the more I think the organization can recognize and say this is important, I think hopefully that will motivate more people to go into the profession. And then my ask for the team, and I've got a really incredible team here, is this obligation to dissent, which is, even if sometimes I might say, hey, this is what I want, being able to reason and say, no, let me ask you 3 questions, Kathleen, and to make sure I'm really solving the right problem, not just going and getting what you think you want. Or you asked for this, but I actually did a few other things, and maybe what you really wanted was this. And so that obligation to dissent and not assume that the people asking you for the data or the insight actually have the right questions, and you have that ability to come back and give them even more insight.
Can we elaborate real quickly, because not all bosses out there are as open-minded as you are?
No, thank you.
What advice would you give to analysts who need to dissent without necessarily having been explicitly licensed to dissent? So it's some advice on how you do that in a way that remains persuasive.
That is, it's challenging if you're not in a culture that really values diversity and inclusion and different thought and different ideas. I mean, that's what we're really focused on with this growth mindset and diversity and inclusion, which is how do you really welcome all voices. So I don't have an easy answer except for just have the fortitude to do it.
Persist. Great. Dan.
Well, I think that if you're in a big organization, you have a great privilege, which is that you can pilot something. You take a division and say, okay, you guys are going to try this new wacky thing. And we'll give you as long as you need to do it. But there are some organizations that are smaller and they have trouble doing something like that. In sports leagues, especially in soccer, we run into this problem all the time because there are some leagues that have relegation, which means if you finish at the bottom, you actually go down to the minor leagues and you make a lot less money there. And that's catastrophic. So the teams are a lot more risk averse. But if you're in an American sports league, there's no relegation. The 76ers are still in the NBA, from what I understand. Good for them. And they're still getting all the revenue sharing thanks to our usual socialist system in American sports. So they're in a great position to experiment. They can really try it for the long haul as long as the owners are in it for the long haul. That's not true for everybody. I think we have to be sensitive to that context.
Any last words, any last piece of advice to the crowd who are largely analysts trying to push out those limits?
Don't forget the human stuff. Ed Catmull at Pixar was once asked, what do you do with the really smart, really talented people who are kind of jerks that are difficult to work with? And he said, we fire them. There are plenty of other smart people out there. Maybe you're not measuring enough different stuff. And a lot of it does have to do with those interpersonal relationships.
Elon has a no assholes policy.
No
his
assholes?
companies. No assholes.
He's not an asshole, though, is he? You met him.
He's something. I don't know. But he said people don't want to, their boss or their coworker is not a pleasant person. They're not going to want to come to work. They're not going to stay at work. They're not going to want to work crazy hours. I want them to work. So I agree with you.
So, Cade, maybe I would put you on the spot because something what Danny Kahneman talked about last night, and even one of the papers you wrote about how to overcome algorithm aversion. Can you give a 45-second version on, because it's the best of both worlds. It's following an algorithm that can get me to a better spot, but give me a little bit of latitude so I feel like I'm empowered and so forth.
We'll find more ways, but the first thing that we found is that giving people a little bit of play, a little bit of influence over the algorithm makes a huge amount of difference in the willingness to take up the algorithm. And what we found that's surprising is it can be just the slightest amount. So if you could allow them to move an algorithm 10%, they like it better, they'll use it more. If you allow them to move it only 5% or only 2%, turns out they like it just as much. It's just a chance to will some influence over it is what we're finding. Okay, terrific. Thank you guys very much. Appreciate the panel.